Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, I have complained several times on this channel that there is a dearth of resources when it comes to the task of getting in-depth analysis on what's happening in Poland, especially now that the EU-obedient cathedral media is regurgitating the leftist tropes in an attempt to delegitimize the current conservative power in Warsaw, led by the Conservative Party, Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, which is the Law and Justice Party. So when I found this article on the Romanian conservative publication În Linie Dreaptă, I knew I had to translate it and bring it to you since, for now, most of the information and analysis in it simply doesn't exist in English anywhere. Also, I have submitted my English translation to the În Linie Dreaptă editorial board, so they'll publish it soon, so you can read it and pass it around in case you prefer written format to video format. So, this is an interview by Anka Czernia, a Catholic medic and a speaker of Polish language, interviewing Bronisław Wildstein, a Polish journalist and writer, and a prominent anti-communist dissident during the Solidarity movement's period. The interview is very long, but I'll translate it in its entirety because it's mostly excellent and it touches on multiple things from Russian imperialism to the protests in Poland, the protests in Romania, the fibs of the European Union, and so on and so forth. I will stop to explain certain terms from time to time, but basically I'll present you the full translation. So, the interview starts with a comparison between the Polish justice system and the Romanian justice system. The interviewer asks, certain commentators are comparing the protests to defend the rule of law in Romania with the Polish opposition's protests. You wrote in Polish about the reformation of the Romanian justice system, so you know both sides. What do you think about this comparison? Bronisław Wildstein. Such a comparison is nonsensical. One may find superficial semblances between the two, but nothing of substance to sustain the comparison. And this is because the situation in Romania is radically different from the one in Poland, especially when it comes to the justice system. In Romania, during the two terms of President Băsescu and the government he supported, especially during the time when Mrs. Macovei was the justice minister, the reformation of the justice system has indeed been accomplished. The Romanian justice system was reformed to such an extent that it is now indeed a barrier against the corruption, and it is indeed defending the society from the post-communist oligarchy who would definitely want to take over the whole power. Sometimes this oligarchy is successful here and there, but it is always bounced back by the barrier of the justice system. This barrier has been consistently constituted since it persists in prosecuting the corrupt politicians who, in the absence of this barrier, would do whatever they please. This is not the case in Poland, where the justice system's reform process has just begun now. In Poland, the situation is exactly the opposite of the Romanian status quo. In Poland, we have a justice system that comes straight from the communist system, especially the so-called magistrates' corporation. Basically, at the round table in the year 1989, when the transition of power from the communists to freely elected governments was negotiated, it was established that the judges would not be fired for political reasons. This meant, in de facto terms, that the composition of the justice system of the communist regime was fully transferred into the post-communist regime. Here I should add that although surely there were exceptions, and indeed there were decent judges even during the communist regime, still, by and large, these people were not appointed because they had the highest moral and professional standards. As we can all remember, they were appointed to serve the interests of the regime. They were meant to be an instrument of accomplishing the totalitarian policy. It was said in early 1990s, after the fall of communism in Poland, that the fact that the judges are appointed for life is a great gain. This is absurd. Now sure, in certain Western European countries, judges cannot be kicked out for political reasons, but they are also appointed right from the get-go on competence criteria as a constitutional element of the rule of law. This was not the case in the justice system back in the communist era, quite the opposite. The People's Republic of Poland was not a state with the rule of law. This is something that is openly acknowledged even by the judges of that era. In fact, the appointees of the communist era, who are still judges today, who even broke the law of that time too, they defend themselves in public by saying that the People's Republic was not a state with the rule of law. Moreover, this justice system was very meticulously purged during the martial law, when almost all judges who weren't entirely obedient to the communist power were fired. Those who objected even the slightest, and even those who weren't executing the will of the communist power with enough zeal, they were all fired. Now here I should mention that the martial law was instituted by the communists in December 1981 with the aim of quashing the solidarity movement. Anyway, back to the interview. Wildstein continues, therefore, this corporation of judges was entirely inherited by the Third Polish Republic, which is the name for modern-day Poland. The Second Polish Republic is the Communist Republic. Of course, one can say that many years, 27 of them, have passed since then, but this is a highly specific corporation, one that self-replicates. The judges themselves are the ones that appoint new judges, and they appoint people in their own image and likeness. There exists a very specific typology of person considered, not to mention the family relationships, as judges are literally bred inside the same families. They're almost a caste, and that comes from the communist regime. Although this isn't always the case, they specifically look after a certain kind of attitude towards things when appointing a new judge. And of course, we can find many decent judges in the Third Republic or in contemporary Poland. But generally speaking, we're dealing with a corporation whose purpose is defending the status quo, defending an oligarchic power exerted by the few in their own interests. That's the power in the Third Polish Republic. An element of this power, perhaps the most important one, was precisely the judicial corporation. These reforms that are currently being proposed do represent an attempt to give the judicial power back to the society, because up until now it was entirely in the hands of this caste, and the term caste was even used by a known judge from the Polish Judges Union, which is the decision-making body of the Judges Corporation. Of course, the judges should be independent in what they're doing, in making decisions, and in judging the cases in their courts. But they shouldn't rule, like it is the case now in Poland. They shouldn't rule over all aspects and be no element of choice, and the society having no influence whatsoever over what's going on in the justice system. In the United States, judges are elected. In most of Europe, the elected officials have a say in appointing people in various levels of the justice system. No such check and balance exists in Poland. Everything is decided by the judge, and any attempt to democratize this situation, to allow the representatives of the society to have at least some influence over the halls of power of the justice system, any such attempt is painted as an attack against the independence of the judiciary, which is really pushing it to absurd levels of dishonesty. As a result, I will say this again, the judges, this corporation of judges, have become the main defenders of the status quo, the ones that blocked any change, and in doing so, they blocked, in fact, the democratically expressed choice of the citizens. It is thus a situation that is exactly the opposite of what's the case in Romania. Interviewer: so you're saying there was no reform in the Polish justice system in the last 27 years? Wildstein: no, not until now, no. Only now there are some reforms being adopted, and I really hope they will be implemented. In fact, these things have manifested themselves in the case of the Constitutional Court during the previous government, led by Prawo i Sprawiedliwość between 2005 and 2007. The Constitutional Court blocked almost all of the laws proposed by the government, claiming that their spirit was against the Constitution's spirit. And the Constitution's spirit was whatever the supposedly all-knowing judges were guessing that week. The same is the case with the whole scandal created by the Civic Platform Party, which decided to appoint 5 judges in advance. namely before the predecessors had finished their turn. The civic platform appointed them precisely so as the new power be incapable of appointing new people. This was the root of that big scandal that made international headlines around the Polish Constitutional Court. I hope that scandal is finally over and that we will now be able to introduce reforms that will give the justice system back to the society, at least in part. The issues run deep with the Polish justice system. The courts run poorly and the Polish people have very little faith in the justice system. All polling data shows that the majority of the citizens don't trust the courts. It's a system of institutions that works poorly and slowly, which means it brings various economic consequences since you can't get justice in the court and the cases run forever for years on end. The Judges Corporation was involved in a series of scandals over the years too. We're now dealing with the rather famous scandal of restituting the real estate properties in Warsaw. The scandal is like this. Allegedly, the rightful owners of various real estate in Warsaw are being given back the properties that was stolen from them by the communist power. That's the official story. In reality, the real owners, for various reasons, could not find their way through the entire bureaucracy of the city hall and the justice system, so they sold their rights for claim for minuscule prices to the people inside the system, judges, lawyers, jurists, and so on. And then these people managed to get these properties almost immediately, and it's highly expensive real estate we're talking about here. This is just one example of the shenanigans pulled by the Judges Corporation. The problem is that this corporation was never held to account. The judges have immunity, so in order for a judge to be held accountable for a crime, a collegial court has to agree. These cooperative courts and these commissions have almost never agreed to allow the prosecution of any judge. Moreover, they never agreed even to suspend or remove a judge from his or her position, no matter the charges. There was a highly famous story when an independent Polish journalist posed as a collaborator of Donald Tusk, now president of the European Council, by the way, and called Judge Milewski from the Gdansk courthouse and asked him to arrange a set and component of a case and change the term in a case of the Amber Gold affair. This was illegal, but the judge agreed entirely to do it. When the story was made public, for a while, nothing happened. In the end, after a huge storm, the judge in the story was quote-unquote punished by being moved to Białystok courthouse. That was the punishment. I could go on like this endlessly about how the justice system in Poland works, but I will stop here. The interviewer. One of the most frequent slogans in the Romanian protests was "PSD is the Red Plague." This shows that people are indeed aware of the fact that the origin of corruption stands with communism. What is the situation in Poland? Who governs? Who is the opposition? How do they all see themselves in relation to the communist past? And what's their relationship with the topic of corruption and the topic of justice? Wildstein. Speaking strictly politically, the post-communist party, the SLD, that comes straight from the Communist Party and is the political party that ruled during the communist era, lost its significance completely, and in the last elections it didn't even make the threshold to get into the current parliament. However, it needs to be said that there was another confrontation, again between 2005 and 2007, following the Rywin affair, which revealed that this system in Poland, when the post-communist governed, it shows that behind the closed door, beyond this appearance of rule of law and democratic system, in fact the most powerful do rule and establish various things and do whatever suits them and is profitable for them. Then their bidding is fully confirmed in the necessary institutions, such as the parliament. Here basically Wildstein is talking about the Polish deep state without calling it the Polish deep state. And how the post-communist power managed to keep its own deep state in power for almost 20 years after communism had collapsed. Also, the Rywin affair is a 2002 corruption scandal in which the Soviet-born individual named Lev Rywin tried to bribe a newspaper to do the bidding for the post-communist party, the SLD. It's a very, very complicated affair, but the result of which was a snowball effect because it popped up other similar cases and triggered a higher push for more transparency both in the government and in the media. Anyway, back to the article. In 2005, this is still Bronisław Wildstein, in 2005 it took place the most important collapse of SLD, which then lost the election, and the collapse continued up to the last elections when the SLD didn't even reach the 5% threshold to be in the parliament. On the other hand, it can be said that the system of the Third Republic is and was an oligarchic in nature, namely a system where a few people dominate in their own interests. But this power is the power of this oligarchy is distributed. The political governance is just one side of the power. In the contemporary world, the power is in the business field of big corporations, such as the corporation of the judges, the corporation of the jurists, the media corporations, and of course the cultural circles. These groups comprise a system that owns the power and gets privileges, and it takes advantage of the situation in which a weak state can be the prey. This role used to be fulfilled by the post-communist party, but it has since been taken over by the Civic Platform party. In its 2 terms, in 8 years of governance, the Civic Platform represented the political branch of this system. They basically started doing what the post-communist SLD used to do. In this sense, the clear distinction in Poland between the post-communists and the people of the Solidarity movement ceased to exist between 2005 and 2007. This is the case because this party, the Civic Platform, also claims its ties to the roots of the Solidarity movement. But the whole system of the Third Republic can be considered a classical post-communist system, a classical post-communist oligarchy in which the strongest group came straight from the communist regime. The judiciary is a perfect example of one such group. The interviewer: Another comparison between Romania and Poland has been made relating to the fact that the ruling party, the Social Democrats here, claim that the protesters in various Romanian cities refused to acknowledge the result of the elections. As I'm sure you know, Romania had general elections in December 2006 and the Social Democrats won them. It is a relative victory since a huge chunk of the electorate did not vote, but nevertheless, the Social Democrats won. The protesters say, though, that during the campaign, the Social Democrats did not mention anything about attacking the justice system or amending the criminal code in this fashion. The same comparison was made with Poland too, because in Poland the opposition refuses to accept that it lost the elections and that Prawo i Sprawiedliwość is now the ruling party. Bronisław Wildstein: Yes, but we cannot compare all the aspects because in these 2 countries the justice system is completely and utterly different. I do understand the Romanians' protests, who say that the Social Democrats, the post-communist party in your case, did not campaign for the things that it is doing now, things that I can say are definitely undermining the rule of law that was accomplished in Băsescu's time. In Poland, however, as I was saying, things are exactly the other way around. In Poland, we don't have the rule of law. We can at best say we have the rule of jurists. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party campaigned for profound reforms, including a thorough reform of the judiciary. So the Law and Justice Party is not doing anything that it did not promise to do. So it's a whole different situation than in Romania. In fact, this is why the Law and Justice Party was elected in the first place in Poland, because it did offer and promised a profound reform, a fundamental change of this country, if you want, and bringing back the state institutions to work for the people. This was the manifesto of the Law and Justice Party, and they're now executing it. They haven't done, so far, anything that they didn't promise they'll do. The opposition, right from the get-go, opposed this party's very right to govern. The whole scandal around the Constitutional Court that I mentioned earlier in this interview is tied to the fact that this move was going to be the liberal left's insurance policy, through which the Law and Justice could be elected, of course, but could not do anything of substance since all of its decisions would have been blocked by the Constitutional Court, which would have been entirely dominated by the people connected with the old power, not just the Civic Platform, but the whole system, because I was saying earlier, the Civic Platform is just the political branch of the system. Various recordings have been published in the press, for instance on the Wypolitycie portal, which shows how the former president of the Constitutional Court, Andrzej Rzepliński, was saying that we must immediately tackle the legislative projects of the Conservatives and block the very possibility of them being implemented. He outright said it. So knowing this, the situations are not comparable at all. Here in Poland, we have a very real attempt of blocking the democratic process. I would remind everyone that the so-called Committee for the Defense of Democracy was founded the next day after the election night. The constitutional scandal had not begun yet. That one happened later on. There was no controversy at that point. Yet right from the next day after the election, this organization started whining to whomever would listen that the new ruling party is totalitarian in nature, that it aspires to rule in a totalitarian fashion, that it wants to take over everything, etc., etc. That is total nonsense. Interviewer: Poland was harshly criticized by the EU, by the European Commission. There were even special hearings dedicated to Poland in the European Parliament. There were a few whispers of concerns about Romania too, albeit much fewer. But those who protest in Bucharest and across the country are content with these interventions by the EU. On the other hand, the Social Democrats are mad at these interventions. Moreover, the government and Liviu Dragnea, the leader of the biggest political party, complained that multinational corporations and various international networks, such as Soros's networks, were involved in the protests by encouraging them or even paying for them. Wildstein: I'll get back to what I said earlier. The situation is not comparable. I do understand the European Union's minor actions in the case of Romania, and they do have a rather positive character. They're definitely not unjustifiable, as the defense of the rule of law that was achieved in Romania is a positive thing. But in the case of Poland, the EU is out of its league and it's interfering in internal affairs where it doesn't have jurisdiction, and it's doing it solely motivated by politics. We have to look at this from a broader perspective. The EU has more and more of this kind of character. The entirety of the West has this oligarchic character. The phenomenon, which acutely manifested itself in Poland in the form of the oligarchy that I just described to you, is a phenomenon encountered all over the West. Sure, it's not directly tied to communism, but it's a system of the dominant elites that represent the ideology of the liberal left. This dominant ideology, in turn, serves as legitimacy and justification of these elites exerting their power. What we see now in the West constitutes the revolt of the nations against this type of situation. In the US, through Trump's victory, putting aside for a moment Trump's person and character, we're basically dealing with a revolt of regular people against the oligarchization of the social life, against the elites that impose a certain ideology who beat down fundamental identities such as the national identity. The phenomenon is much more generalized, and I'm thinking here at what happened in Hungary and Poland too. Regardless of how we look at those elected, they were still elected to represent the people that opposed this dominant ideology. And this triggered the West's indignation, because the West adopted this dominating ideology wholesale, with all of its manifestation and with all of its new generations of so-called human rights, which in fact no longer have anything to do with the fundamental rights of man. This whole counterculture chips at the foundational identities of humans, starting with the national identity and ending with family and sexual identity. All identities need to be questioned or abolished, all in the name of quote-unquote emancipation and liberation, which in fact is neither emancipation nor liberation, but rather a deprivation of a person's identity. Questioning and opposing this ideology brought indignation. This is one aspect of the issue. The other aspect is that these representatives of the people are inconvenient in the dominant systems in the West for the big business, who will have to face the defenders of national interest and not those who would bow down to the strong both domestically and abroad. Which is why we see here a blending of interests, of ideas, and concrete material interests. So this is the root of the pressure exerted by the dominant circles of the European Union. But we must say that we live in a moment in which this construction made almost 30 years ago, which seemed to solidify more and more, a construction also constituted on oligarchy, but a construction which is now starting to crack and collapse as the protest by these societies increases. A key word that can be heard more often now in the political jargon of the West is the term populism. All those who question the status quo, this oligarchic system which is justified by this dominant ideology, are called populist. In my opinion, the Law and Justice Party cannot be described as populist. Now, Trump is a whole different matter. But this was indeed the case in Western Europe because certain ideas have been pushed aside from the public debate, because it was simply not allowed to speak in public about various matters, such as the issue of mass Islamic immigration and other issues. These causes were taken over by the populists, like the Front National in France. They are the real populists. The question is, who takes responsibility for the fact that such important matters are being taken over by populists, as this happened because the mainstream parties stay away from them, pretending they don't exist, yet these problems are, at the end of the day, real for the average citizen. Interviewer: we have something highly important in common with Poland, the fact that we have a highly realistic approach when it comes to Russia, and we are under no illusions about Russia. All polling data shows, and everyone knows, that in Romania no politician can openly claim to be pro-Russia. Now, there are reasons to suspect the Social Democrats and Liviu Dragnea that they might be Russia-leaning because they prefer a world without rules for the politicians. What is the situation in Poland? How does Russia see the Law and Justice government, the Committee for the Defense of Democracy protests, and other movements against the ruling party, against Prawo i Sprawiedliwość? Wildstein: the situation is very similar in Poland indeed. It is very hard for someone to have a political career if one is expressing sympathy towards the imperial interests of Russia, or Russia's imperial policy, or accepts the current policy pushed by Putin. Nobody can do that. Even the Civic Platform, which for a short while around the Smolensk disaster behaved as if it wanted to change this relationship, they still had to back off. After all, we are dealing with imperialists who explicitly want to dominate us. They want to recover their old sphere of influence, in which Poland would be subordinated to Russia, at least in matters of international and foreign policy. That's how the story of Poland or Romania being NATO members would be scandalous, or even more, that Poland and Romania want to get arms for themselves as a consequence of their membership. That's how the story became a thing. So this kind of overt pro-Russian politics is just not a thing in Poland at all. There are a few marginal pro-Russian groups, but nothing of big relevance. There is, however, a certain level of dangers that the post-communist party would want to play for Russia. Still, in Poland, so far, none of the big political parties do that. Russia, however, is a different matter. Russia manages to exert its international influence in many aspects. For example, in Poland, the fundamental matter is the relationship with Ukraine. The Poles, naturally, supported the Ukrainians' aspirations towards independence and supported Ukraine against the Russian aggression. Now, as I believe you have observed too, several groups have emerged, tacitly endorsed by Russia, which relentlessly try to revive the old antagonism between Poland and Ukraine. The problem is real, since during World War II in the year 1943, there were indeed horrible massacres in western Ukraine aimed mostly at Polish people. There were in essence ethnic cleansing instances. It is hard to say exactly how many people were killed then, as the information is not thoroughly reliable, but at least 100,000 Polish people perished then. The episode was absolutely horrifying, and these crimes were never tried in a court of law. Moreover, this was the ideology of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which represents the reference point for those who fight for the independence of Ukraine. So these groups insist among present-day Poles and shows them that present-day Ukraine refers to Stepan Bandera and the UPA. Of course, the reality is that present-day Ukraine uses Bandera references as the army that fought for independence, and not because it killed Poles. Most of them don't even know that, because for 50 years under communism, this reality was never presented in the Soviet Union, as they were inconvenient, and these massacres were carried out at the behest of the Soviet Union. In any event, the attempt to seed discord between Poland and Ukraine is an action method by Russia, but of course it's not only that, because in general, this whole giant political offensive has many dimensions and sometimes paradoxical. On one hand, and you guys know this very well, Putin's ideologue Alexander Dugin routinely calls the West putrid and rotten, and against that rotten West, the only refuge, the only bastion which would supposedly defend the Christian tradition, not just the Orthodox one, but the entire Christendom, that role of bastion would be best served by Russia. Now this is a new development, historically speaking, because the old ideologues of Imperial Russia used to say that Russia is the defender of the true Christian tradition, namely the Eastern Orthodox tradition, but now the claims have been widened. We're now supposed to believe that Russia will defend the entirety of the cultural and religious foundations of Europe. So, on one hand, Russia has excellent relationships with those parties that represent the revolt of the society, parties like Front National in France, Alternative für Deutschland in Germany, and so on and so forth. It has excellent connections with those parties, and on the other hand, Russia gets along quite well with parties like SPD in Germany, and SPD manifests itself as being very pro-Russian and generally positions itself against the sanctions. So we have a confused situation right as the West is going through a real shock, politically speaking. I believe this is a fundamental turning point which will last quite a while. I mean, a certain type of politics will end. An era is approaching its end. A certain politico-civilizational construction whose instrument was the European Union is ending. Now the question is, what will come out on the other end from this? Russia is doing its best to break Europe again. On one hand, I am very critical towards the current configuration of the European Union, but on the other hand, I wouldn't want the collapse of everything related to the European community, because some of those common elements are good and real accomplishments. It would not be a good thing if we would get back to entirely closed countries. I hope it won't come to that. However, the unreasonable emphasis on more Europe and more integration into the EU as it is may indeed take us there to more closed rather than open countries. And in all of these, Russia keeps on interfering, trying to break any form of Western community, whether it's the European Union or NATO, and it does that from all sides, from the right, from the left, from whenever it can. Because this is a purely cynical game played by Russia with the purpose of recovering an imperial position. Interviewer: how should the alliance between our nations work in the current geopolitical and cultural context? We all realize the Russian danger, and we have in common, Poland and Romania, a deep attachment to our Christian roots. Vast majorities in both countries declare themselves Christians. In censuses, they affirm a belief in God, and they trust the family, they are against gay marriage, and so on and so forth. And because we have these things in common, we are in the same region, and we have similar historical experiences, how could we develop this alliance? Wildstein: I really do hope the relations between our nations will progress. At the moment, there is the Visegrad group. Formally speaking, Romania is not part of it, but I think and hope that in time it will be extended, and this is precisely because, as you correctly said, we have a certain level of common experiences in various areas. What I mean by that is that we, unlike Western Europe, know all too well that we are mortal. We are mortal nations and mortal cultures. The entirety of history showed that to us. It was first the Turkish threat, though that one was more for you guys than for us. We had to deal mostly with the Russian and German threat. As a result, we lost our independence for hundreds of years, so we know very well that our existence is threatened. This is a consequence that does not exist in this is a conscience, the type of conscience that does not exist in the nations of Western Europe. We also have the conscience of the cultural threat. It's not just the loss of independence, but also the loss of the cultural identity. We lived that to the fullest extent during communism. Communism meant an attempt to uproot our culture. Such an awareness makes our attitude to be much more conservative, as we do realize that we must protect this culture, that in spite of other appearances, this culture is a fragile good that can indeed be lost. In this sense, our region was some sort of a canary in the coal mine for what has now begun all over Europe, through the success of the governments in Hungary and Poland, that this area is not a periphery, but sometimes a trendsetter. So there is a chance that all these nations, Ukraine included, to form a system that can reconstruct the former European culture and influence the reality and the status quo for the whole of Europe. This will be, of course, a very long process. It's funny that the former Polish government used to routinely refer to the Weimar Triangle. The propagandists, the so-called journalists, the controlled media of Poland, used to say that it's great that Poland is part of this triangle with Germany and France, but that meant actually nothing, because we in that triangle meant exactly nothing. And we could not mean anything there because Germany and France are much more powerful than we are. Sure, it meant Donald Tusk or some other establishmentarian could take a nice photo with the others and who would pat him on the back, but that meant nothing in real terms. On the other hand, in an enhanced Visegrad system, we are peoples that are united not only by common interests, but also a common destiny. Besides that, we have the awareness that nobody wants to dominate and none of us has imperial ambitions. We just want to exist, we want to last. We are the ones threatened by Russian imperialism. In this sense, there is a common perspective, but of course accomplishing this will take time, especially culturally. For instance, in Poland, there is this longing desire to be like the West, an idea that is routinely exploited by leftist ideologues who claim that any attempt of making our own destiny is turning back the clock and that all we can do is to be some sort of Frenchmen or Germans, but a bit more stupid. This is, of course, nonsensical. We have our own history, our own identity, and here, as I said, this identity and destiny makes us feel much closer to Romanians, to the Ukrainians, to the Hungarians, and so on, rather than the French or the Germans. Now, I added the last portion to make it more clear. So this was the interview as published by În Linie Dreaptă. I made very minor modifications into the translation process so as to avoid unclear expressions that would make no sense whatsoever in English. The interview is very thorough and goes through most of the current events, and it has a growing style, sort of a crescendo style, if I have to use musical terms. It starts slowly with rather marginal topics, and then it builds up nicely towards its end. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I guess I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.